almost forgot. Then I had one more class. I was like going to go out and start shopping. Do a little. I'm like, oh, I feel good enough to go grocery shopping because usually after class I don't. Then I'm just like, oh, I hope I have enough food in the refrigerator so I don't have to go grocery shopping. But I do. So, let's get to it. We're on chapter 6. We just started chapter 6, got a little bit into it. Oscar takes a vacation. When Oscar had been at Don Bosco nearly 3 years, his moms asked him what plans he had for the summer. The last couple of years, his tío had been spending the better part of July and August in Santo Domingo, and this year his mom had decided it was time to go with. I have not seen mi madre in a long time, she said quietly. I have many promesas to fulfill, so better now than when I'm dead. Oscar hadn't been home in years, not since his abuela's #1 servant, bedridden for months and convinced that the border was about to be reinvaded, had screamed out, Haitians, and then died. And they'd all gone to the funeral. It's strange. If he'd said no, nigger would probably still be okay. If you call being fuku'd being beyond misery okay. But this ain't no Marvel Comics. What if? Speculations will have to wait. Time, as they say, is growing short. That May, Oscar was for once in better spirits. A couple of months earlier, after a particularly nasty bout with the darkness, he'd started another one of his diets and combined it with the long, lumbering walks around the neighborhood. And guess what? The nigger stuck with it and lost close to 20 pounds. A milagro. He finally repaired his ion drive. The evil planet Gordo was pulling him back, but his 50s style rocket, the Hijo de Sacrificio, wouldn't quit. Behold our cosmic explorer, eyes wide, lashed to his acceleration couch, hand over his mutant heart. He wasn't svelte by any stretch of the imagination, but he wasn't Joseph Conrad's wife no more either. Earlier in the month, he'd even spoken to a bespectacled black girl on a bus, said, so you're into photosynthesis. And she'd actually lowered her issue of Cell and said, yes, I am. So what if he hadn't ever gotten past earth sciences, or if he hadn't been able to convert that slight communication into a number or a date? So what if he'd gotten off at the next stop and she hadn't, as he had hoped? Homeboy was, for the first time in 10 years, feeling resurgent. Nothing seemed to bother him. Not his students, not the fact that PBS had canceled Doctor Who, not his loneliness, not his endless flow of rejection letters. He felt insuperable. And Santo Domingo summers, well, Santo Domingo summers have their own particular allure, even for one as nerdy as Oscar. Every summer, Santo Domingo slaps the diaspora engine into reverse, yanks back as many of its expelled children as it can. Airports choke with the overdressed. Necks and luggage carousels groan under the accumulated weight of that year's cadenas and paquetes, and pilots fear for their planes, overburdened beyond belief, and for themselves restaurants, bars, clubs, theaters, malecones, beaches, resorts, hotels, motales, extra rooms, barrios, colonias, campos, ingenios, swarm with Quisqueyanos from the world over, like someone had sounded a general reverse evacuation order. Back home, everybody, back home. From Washington Heights to Roma, from Perth Amboy to Tokyo, from Brihepor to Amsterdam, from Lawrence to San Juan. This is when basic thermodynamic principles gets modified so that reality can now reflect a final aspect, the picking up of big-assed girls and the taking of said 2 moteles. It's one big party for everybody but the poor, the dark, the jobless, the sick, The Haitians, their children, the Bates, the kids that certain Canadian, American, German, and Italian tourists love to rape. Yes, sir. Nothing like a Santo Domingo summer. And so for the first time in years, Oscar said, "My elder spirits have been talking to me, Ma. I think I might accompany you." He was imagining himself in the middle of all that ass-getting, imagining himself in love with an island girl. A brother can't be wrong forever, can he? So abrupt a change in policy was this that even Lola quizzed him about it. "You never go to Santo Domingo." He shrugged. "I guess I want to try something new." The condensed notebook of a return to native land. Family de Leon flew down to the island on the 15th of June. Oscar scared shitless and excited, but no one was funnier than their mother, who got done up like she was having an audience with King Juan Carlos of Spain himself. If she'd owned a fur, she would have worn it. Anything to communicate the distance she'd travel, to emphasize how not like the rest of these Dominicanos she was. Oscar, for one, had never seen her looking so dolled up and elegant, or acting so camparona. Belicia giving everybody a hard time, from the check-in people to the flight attendants, and when they settled into their seats in first class, she was paying. She looked around as if scandalized. These are not gente de calidad. It was also reported that Oscar drooled on himself and didn't wake up for the meal or the movie, only when the plane touched down and everybody clapped. "What's going on?" he demanded, alarmed. "Relax, mister. That just means we made it." The beat-you-down heat was the same, and so was the fecund tropical smell that he had never forgotten, that to him was more evocative than any Madeleine, and likewise the air pollution and the thousands of motos and cars and dilapidated trucks on the roads and the clusters of peddlers at every traffic light, so dark he noticed, and his mother said dismissively, "Maldito Haitianos," and people walking languidly with nothing to shade them from the sun, and the buses that charged past so overflowing with passengers that from the outside they looked like they were making a rush delivery of spare limbs to some far-off war, and the general ruination of so many of the buildings, as if Santo Domingo was the place that crumbled, crippled concrete shells came to die. And the hunger on some of the kids' faces, can't forget that. But also it seemed in many places like a whole new country was materializing atop the ruins of the old one. There were now better roads and nicer vehicles and brand new luxury air-conditioned buses plying the longer routes to the Cibao and beyond, and U.S. fast food restaurants, Dunkin' Donuts and Burger King, and local ones whose names and logos he did not recognize. Polos Victorina and El Provocone number 4. And traffic lights everywhere that nobody seemed to heed. Biggest change of all, a few years back, La Inca had moved her entire operation to La Capital. We're getting too big for Bonnie, and now the family had a new house in Mirador Norte and 6 bakeries throughout the city's outer zones. We're Capitalinos, his cousin Pedro Pablo, who had picked them up at the airport, announced proudly. La Inca, too, had changed since Oscar's last visit. She had always seemed ageless, the family's very own Galadriel. But now he could see that it wasn't true. Nearly all her hair had turned white, and despite her severe unbent carriage, her skin was finely cross-hatched with wrinkles, and she had to put on glasses to read anything. She was still spry and proud, and when she saw him, first time in nearly 7 years, she put her hands on his shoulders and said, "Mi hijo, you have finally returned to us." "Hi, abuela," and then awkwardly, "Benedicción." Nothing more moving than La Inca and his mother. Nothing more moving, though, than La Inca and his mother. At first saying nothing, and then his mother covering her face and breaking down, saying in this little girl voice, "Madre, I'm home." And then the both of them holding each other and crying, and Lola joining them, and Oscar not knowing what to do, so he joined his cousin Pedro Pablo, who was shuttling all the bags from the van to the patio de atrás. It really was astonishing how much he'd forgotten about the Dominican Republic. The little lizards that were everywhere, and the roosters in the morning, followed shortly by the cries of the plataneros and the bacalao guy and his trio Carlos Moya, who smashed him up that first night with shots of Brugal and who got all misty at the memories he had of him and his sister. But what he had forgotten most of all was how incredibly beautiful Dominican women were. Duh, Lola said. On the rides he took those first couple of days, he almost threw his neck out. I'm in heaven, he wrote in his journal. Heaven, his cousin Pedro Pablo sucked his teeth with exaggerated disdain. Esto aquí es un maldito infierno. Infierno. Evidence of a brother's past. In the pictures Lola brought home, there are shots of Oscar in the back of the house reading Octavia Butler, shots of Oscar on the Malecón with a bottle of Presidente in his hand, shots of Oscar at the Columbus Lighthouse where half of Villa Durante used to stand, shots of Oscar with Pedro Pablo in Villa Juana buying spark plugs, shots of Oscar trying on a hat on the Conde, shots of Oscar standing next to a burro in Bonnie, shots of Oscar next to his sister, she in a string bikini that could have blown your corneas out. You can tell he's trying too. He's smiling a lot despite the bafflement in his eyes. He's also, you might notice, not wearing his fat guy coat. Oscar goes native. After his initial homecoming week, after he'd been taken to a bunch of sites by his cousins, after he'd gotten somewhat used to the scorching weather and the surprise of waking up to the roosters and being called Huescar by everybody, that was his Dominican name, something else he'd forgotten. After he refused to succumb to that whisper that all long-term immigrants carry inside themselves, the whisper that says, you do not belong. After he'd gone to about 50 clubs, and because he couldn't dance salsa, merengue, or bachata, he sat and drunk Presidentes while Lola and his cousins burned holes in the floor after he'd explained to people 100 times that he'd been separated from his sister at birth, after he spent a couple of quiet mornings on his own writing after he'd given out all his taxi money to beggars and had to call his cousin Pedro Pablo to pick him up, after he'd watched shirtless, shoeless 7-year-olds fighting each other for the scraps he'd left on his plate at an outdoor cafe, after his mother took him all to dinner in the Zona Colonial and the waiters kept looking at their party askance. Watch out, Mom, Lola said. They probably think you're Haitian. La única Haitiana aquí eres tú, mi amor, she retorted. I'm not sure. I'm trying to translate it. I got it. La única Haitiana. The Haitian one is there. My love, she retorted. I'm not sure though. Sorry. After a skeletal vieja grabbed both his hands and begged him for a penny. After his sister had said, you think that's bad, you should see the baddies after he'd spent a day in Bonnie, the campo where La Inca had been raised, and he'd taken a dump in a latrine and wiped his ass with a corn cob. Now that's entertainment, he wrote in his journal. After he'd gotten somewhat used to the surreal whirligig that was life in La Capitale, the guagas, the cops, the mind-boggling poverty, the Dunkin' Donuts, the beggars, the Haitians selling roasted peanuts at the intersection, the mind-boggling poverty, the asshole tourists hogging up all beaches, the Exica da Silva Novales, where homegirl got naked every 5 seconds, that Lola and his female cousins were cracked on, the afternoon walks on the Conde, the mind-boggling poverty, the snarl of streets and rusting zinc shacks that were the barrios populares, the masses of niggers he waded through every day who ran over if he stood still, the skinny watchmen standing in front of stores and the broken down shotguns, the music, the raunchy jokes heard on the street, the mind-boggling poverty, being pile-drived into the corner of a concho by the combined weight of 4 other customers, the music, the new tunnels driving down into the bauxite earth, the signs that banned donkey carts from the same tunnels after he'd gone to Boca Chica and Villa Maya, and eaten so much chicharrones he had to throw up on the side of the road. Now that, his Tio Rodolfo said, is entertainment. After his Tio Carlos Moya berated him for having stayed away so long, after his abuela berated him for having stayed away so long, after his cousins berated him for having stayed away so long, after he saw again the unforgettable beauty of the Sabayo, after he heard the stories about his mother, after he stopped marveling at the amount of political propaganda plastered up on every spare wall, ladrones, his mother announced, one and all, after the touched in the head Tio, who'd been tortured during Balegua's reign, came over and got into a heated political argument with Carlos Moya, after which they both got drunk. After he'd caught his first unborn his first sunburn in Boca Chica, after he'd swum in the Caribbean, after Tio Rodolfo had gotten him blasted on marijuana de Marisco, after he'd seen his first Haitians kicked off a guagua because niggers claimed they smelled, after he'd nearly got nuts over all the bellezas he saw, after he helped his mother install 2 new air conditioners and crushed his finger so bad he had dark blood under the nail, after all the gifts they'd brought had been properly distributed, after Lola introduced him to the boyfriend she dated as a teenager, now a capitaneo as well, after he'd seen the pictures of Lola in her private school uniform, a tall muchacha with heartbreak eyes, after he'd brought flowers to his abuela's #1 servant's grave, who had taken care of him when he was little, after he had diarrhea so bad his mouth watered before each detonation, after he'd visited all the rinky-dink museums in the capital with his sister, after he'd stopped being dismayed that everybody called him Gordo and worse, Gringo, after he'd been overcharged for almost everything he wanted to buy, after La Inca prayed over him nearly every morning after he caught a cold because his abuela set the air conditioner in his room so high, he decided suddenly and without warning to stay on the island for the rest of the summer and with his mother and his Tio. Not to go home with Lola. It was a decision that came to him one night on the Malecon while staring out over the ocean. What do I have waiting for me in Patterson, he wanted to know. He wasn't teaching that summer, and he had all his notebooks with him. Sounds like a good idea to me, his sister said. You need some time in the Patria. Maybe you'll even find yourself a nice campesina. It felt like the right thing to do. Help clear his head and his heart of the gloom that had filled them these months. His mother was less hot on the idea, but La Inca waved her into silence. Hijo, you can stay here all your life, though he found it strange that she made him put on a crucifix immediately thereafter. So after Lola flew back to the States, take good care of yourself, mister, and the terror and joy of his return had subsided after he settled down in Abuela's house, the house that Diaspora had built, and tried to figure out what he was going to do with the rest of his summer now that Lola was gone. After his fantasy of an island girlfriend seemed like a distant joke, who the fuck had he been kidding? He couldn't dance. He couldn't have loot. He didn't dress. He wasn't confident. He wasn't handsome. He wasn't from Europe. He wasn't fucking no island girls. After he spent 1 week writing and, ironically enough, turned down his male cousin's offer to take him to a whorehouse like 50 times, Oscar fell in love with the semi-retired puta. Her name was Iban Pimentel. Oscar considered her the start of his real life. La Beba. La Beba. She lived 2 houses over and, like the De Leons, was a newcomer to Mirador Norte. Oscar's mom had bought their house with double shifts at her 2 jobs. Iban bought hers with double shifts too, but in a window in Amsterdam. She was one of those golden mulatas that French-speaking Caribbeans call chabines, that my boys call chicas de oro. She had snarled, apocalyptic hair, copper eyes, and was one white-skinned relative away from Jabba. At first, Oscar thought she was only a visitor, this tiny, slightly paunchy babe who was always high-heeling it out to her Pathfinder. She didn't have the Nuevo Mundo wannabe American look of the majority of his neighbors. The 2 times Oscar bumped into her during breaks in his writing, he would go for walks along the hot, bland cul-de-sacs or sit at the local cafe. She smiled at him, and the third time they saw each other, here, folks, is where the miracles begin. She sat at his table and said, "What are you reading?" At first, he didn't know what was happening, and then he realized, holy shit, a female was talking to him. It was an unprecedented change in fortune, as though his threadbare skein of destiny had accidentally gotten tangled with that of a doper, more fortunate brother. Turned out Iban knew his abuela, gave her rides whenever Carlos Moya was out making deliveries. "You're the boy in her picture," she said with a sly smile. "I was little," he said defensively, "and besides, that was before the war changed me." She didn't laugh. "That's probably what it was. Well, I have to go. I have to go." On went the shades, up went the ass, out went the belleza. Oscar's erection following her like a dowser's wand. Iban had attended the UASD a long time ago, but she was no college girl. She had lines around her eyes and seemed to Oscar at least mad open, mad worldly, had the sort of intense zipper gravity that hot middle-aged women exude effortlessly. The next time he ran into her in front of her house, he had watched for her. She said, "Good morning, Mr. De Leon," in English. "How are you?" "I am well," he said. "And you?" She beamed. "I am well, thank you." He didn't know what to do with his hands, so he laced them behind his back like a gloomy parson. And for a minute, there was nothing, and she was unlocking her gate, and he said desperately, "It is very hot." "I see," she said. "And I thought it was just my menopause." And then looking over her shoulder at him, curious perhaps at this strange character who was trying not to look at her at all, or recognizing how in crush he was with her, and feeling charitable, she said, "Come inside, I'll give you a drink." The casa near empty, his abuela's crib was spare, but this was on some next shit. "Haven't had the time to move in yet," she said offhandedly, and because there wasn't any furniture besides a kitchen table, a chair, a bureau, a bed, and a TV, they had to sit on the bed. Oscar peeped the astrology book under the bed, and a collection of Paulo Coelho's novels. She followed his gaze and said with a smile, "Paulo Coelho saved my life." She gave him a beer and had a double scotch, then for the next 6 hours regaled him with tales from her life. You could tell she hadn't had anyone to talk to in a long time. Oscar reduced to nodding and trying to laugh when she laughed. The whole time he was sweating bullets, wondering if this is when he should try something. It wasn't until midway through their chat that it hit Oscar that job Ebone talked so volubly about was prostitution. It was holy shit, the sequel. Even though putas were one of Santo Domingo's premier exports, Oscar had never been in a prostitute's house in his entire life. Staring out her bedroom window, he saw his abuela on her front lawn looking for him. He wanted to raise the window and call to her, but Iban didn't allow for any interruptions. Iban was an odd bird. She might have been talkative, the sort of easygoing woman a brother can relax around. But there was something slightly detached about her, too, as though Oscar's words now, she were some marooned alien princess who existed partially in another dimension. The sort of woman who, cool as she was, slips out of your head a little too quickly. A quality she recognized and was thankful for, as though she relished the short burst of attention she provoked from men, but not anything sustained. She didn't seem to mind being the girl you called every couple of months at 11 at night just to see what she was up to. As much relationship as she could handle. Reminds me of the Mora Viver plants we played with as kids, except in reverse. Her Jedi mind tricks did not, however, work on Oscar. When it came to girls, the brother had a mind like a yogi. He latched on and stayed latched. By the time he left her house that night and walked home through the island's million attack mosquitoes, he was lost. Did it matter that Iban started mixing in Italian in with her Spanish after the fourth drink, or that she almost fell flat on her face when she showed him out? Of course not. He was in love. His mother and his abuela met him at the door. Excuse the stereotype, but both had their hair in rolos and couldn't believe his sinvergüencería. Do you know that woman's a puta? Do you know she called that house culiando? For a moment he was overwhelmed by their rage, and then he found his footing and shot back. Do you know her aunt was a judge? Do you know her father worked for the phone company? You want a woman, I'll get you a good woman, his mother said, peering angrily out the window. But that puta's only going to take your money. I don't need your help, and she ain't a puta. La Inca laid one of her looks of incredible power on him. Hijo, obey your mother. For a moment he almost did, both women focusing all their energies on him, and then he tasted the beer on his lips and shook his head. His Tio Rodolfo, who was watching the game on the TV, took that moment to call out in his best Grandpa Simpson voice, "Prostitutes ruined my life." More miracles. The next morning, Oscar woke up, and despite the tremendous tidings in his heart, despite the fact that he wanted to run over to Iban's house and shackle himself to her bed, he didn't. He knew he had to Cogerlo con take it easy. Knew he had to rein in his lunatic heart or he would blow it. Whatever it was. Of course the nigger was entertaining mad fantasies inside his head. What do you expect? He was not so fat boy who'd never kissed a girl, never even lain in bed with one, and now the world was waving a beautiful puta under his nose. Ebone, he was sure, was the higher power's last-ditch attempt to put him back on the proper path of Dominican malitude. If he blew this, well, it was back to playing villains and vigilantes for him. This is it, he told himself, his chance to win. He decided to play the oldest card in the deck, the wait. So for one whole day, he moped around the house, tried to write but couldn't, watched a comedy show where black Dominicans in grass skirts put white Dominicans in safari outfits into cannibal cook pots, and everybody wondered aloud where their bizcocho was. Scary. By noon, he had driven Dolores, the 38-year-old heavily scarred muchacha who cooked and cleaned for the family, up a wall. The next day at 1, he pulled on a clean Chibana and strolled over to her house. Well, he sort of trotted. A red Jeep was parked outside, nose to nose with her Pathfinder, a Policia Nacional plate. He stood in front of her gate while the sun stomped down on him. Felt like a stooge. Of course he was married. Of course she had boyfriends. His optimism, that swollen red giant, collapsed down to an obliterating point of gloom from which there was no escape. Didn't stop him coming back the next day, but no one was home, and by the time he saw her again 3 days later, he was starting to think that she had warped back to whatever forerunner world had spawned her. Where were you? He said, trying not to sound as miserable as he felt. I thought maybe you fell in the tub or something. She smiled and gave her ass a little shiver. I was making the patria strong, mi amor. He had caught her in front of the TV doing aerobics in a pair of sweatpants and what might have been described as a halter top. It was hard for him not to stare at her body. When she first let him in, she'd screamed, Oscar Querido, come in, come in. Querido. I think it's like my wish. I think that's what that is. Oscar, I wished. Come in, come in. A note from your author. Okay, we're going to pick it up with a note from the author on Tuesday. So we will be back here getting close to finishing up our great story on the brief, wondrous life of Oscar. Whoa. This is Dr. Annette Feravich. Thanks for joining me here in the classroom. Specifically, thanks for joining me here in the reading room. Oh, this book is so good. Thanks.